The world, for 10-year-old Imani, had shrunk to the size of 4 peeling walls and a leaking roof. It was a small, damp world that smelled of old wood, rain, and her grandmother's herbal remedies. Their house stood on a forgotten street in a forgotten part of the city, a place where the streetlights had given up long ago and hope was a currency they couldn't afford. It was a crooked little house, leaning into its neighbors like an old man seeking support, its porch groaning under the weight of years of neglect. Imani's grandmother, Elara, was the queen of this tiny, crumbling kingdom. Her throne was a worn armchair, its floral patterns faded into a ghostly memory of what they once were. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, were rarely still, either shelling peas, mending Imani's worn clothes with thread as thin as a spider's silk, or simply trembling with the effort of holding on. Elara's stories were Imani's inheritance, tales of a sunnier, kinder world that felt as distant as the moon. But their world was no longer sunny or kind. It was shadowed by a man named Silas. He wasn't a landlord in any official sense. He was more like a vulture who had claimed the entire block as his carrion. He owned the debt, he owned the fear, and he wanted to own their house. He saw the land, not the home. He saw profit, not the pencil marks on the doorframe charting Imani's growth from a toddler into a girl with shoulders too heavy for her age. His visits were like storms gathering on the horizon. First, you'd hear the rumble of his beat-up car, then the slam of a door, followed by the heavy, confident thud of his boots on the sidewalk. He always brought 2 of his men, silent statues of menace who stood behind him, their arms crossed, their eyes as empty as the boarded-up windows across the street. "Morning, Elara," Silas would say, his voice a greasy smear in the clean morning air. He never looked at Imani, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. "Getting a bit drafty in here, isn't it? A strong wind could take this whole place down." "Be a shame if that happened," Elara would just stare at him, her face a mask of weary defiance. "This house has stood for 70 years. It will stand for 70 more," Silas would laugh, a short, barking sound that held no joy. "Paperwork says otherwise. Says you're behind. Says this property is a liability. I'm doing the city a favor, cleaning it up." He'd tap a rolled-up document against his palm. It wasn't official. It was his own creation, printed on cheap paper but backed by the undeniable authority of fear. He was a petty tyrant in a kingdom of the powerless. Imani would hide behind her grandmother's chair, her small hands clenched into fists. Fear was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. It was the reason she walked the long way home from school, the reason she flinched at loud noises, the reason she checked the locks on the doors and windows 3 times before bed. The police? They were a joke. The one time Elara had called, 2 officers had come, listened with bored expressions, and told her it was a civil matter. They had looked at Silas, who was leaning against his car across the street, and then they had looked at Elara's crumbling porch, and they had made a choice. They chose the path of least resistance. They drove away and never came back. The harassment had grown bolder. A rock through the window one night. The garden hose slashed the next. Their trash cans were always knocked over, the contents strewn across their small, struggling lawn like a deliberate insult. Each act was a message, a chipping away at their resolve. Silas was a patient predator, content to circle, to wear them down until they had nothing left to fight with. And it was working. Elara's cough was getting worse in the damp house, and the worry was carving new, deeper lines into her face. Imani felt like a soldier in a war nobody else could see, fighting a battle with no weapons. She did what she could. She patched the window with cardboard and tape. She tried to fix the fence with twine. She picked up the trash, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a righteous fury that had no outlet. She was just a child, and her love for her grandmother was a fierce, protective shield, but it was a shield made of glass, and she knew it was about to shatter. Then came the day the rain refused to stop. It was a Tuesday, a day as gray and miserable as all the others. The rain fell in a steady, relentless sheet, turning the street into a dark, shimmering river. It drummed against the roof, a constant reminder of the leak in the kitchen that dripped into a bucket with a hollow, rhythmic plink. 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 The sound of their home slowly coming apart. It was on this day that a different kind of thunder rolled down their street. It was not the sound of Silas's car. It was deeper, a guttural roar that seemed to vibrate up from the asphalt itself. Imani, who was trying to read a schoolbook by the dim light of the living room window, looked up. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw it. A motorcycle, big and black and gleaming with chrome, sputtered to a stop directly in front of their house. It coughed once, twice, a plume of smoke rising from its exhaust, and then fell silent. The man on the bike was a giant. He was built like a mountain, draped in black leather that was dark and slick with rain. A thick, graying beard covered the lower half of his face, and his hair was long and wild. On the back of his vest was a patch, a grinning skull with wings. Below it, in bold letters, were the words that made people in this city lock their doors and cross the street. Hell's Angels. He swung a heavy leg over the bike and stood, his boots planting themselves on the ground with solid finality. He kicked at a tire, then swore under his breath, the sound swallowed by the rain. He was stranded. Imani, get away from the window, Elara's voice was sharp with fear. Don't you look at him. Trouble comes in all shapes, and that one is the biggest shape I've ever seen. Imani pulled back, her heart thumping against her ribs. She had heard the stories. She knew who these men were supposed to be. Dangerous. Lawless. But as she peeked again from behind the curtain, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man, soaked to the bone, stranded in the pouring rain, looking at his broken machine with a frustration she understood. It was the same frustration she felt when she looked at their leaking roof, at the eviction notice, at her own powerlessness. He pulled out a tool from a saddlebag and began to work, his huge hand surprisingly nimble. The rain plastered his hair to his head and ran in rivulets down his leather vest. He didn't seem to notice the cold. He was focused, a man with a problem to solve. Imani watched him for what felt like an hour. The neighborhood was silent. No one came out. No one offered help. Doors were shut. Curtains were drawn tight. He was an island, isolated by his appearance, by the reputation that rode with him like a ghost. And in that moment, Imani felt a strange kinship with him. She knew what it was like to be alone. She knew what it was like to be judged and feared and left to fend for yourself. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, when you can help, you help. It doesn't matter who it is. A soul in need is a soul in need. She made a decision. It was a small, quiet decision, made in the dusty silence of her living room, but it felt momentous, like stepping off a cliff. She went to the kitchen. The bucket was half full. Plink. Plink. She ignored it. She took their cleanest glass from the shelf and filled it with water. Then, she took one of the 2 apples sitting in a bowl on the counter. It was slightly bruised on one side, but it was the best she had to offer. Imani, what are you doing? Elara asked, her voice tight with alarm as Imani walked to the front door. My grandma says when you can help, you help, Imani said softly, her voice barely a whisper. It was the truest thing she knew. She opened the door. The sound of the rain rushed in. The air was cold and wet. The biker didn't look up at first. He was still hunched over his engine. Imani walked slowly down the 3 rickety porch steps, her bare feet cold on the wet concrete. She held the glass of water and the apple in front of her like a sacred offering. She stopped a few feet away from him. Sir. He finally looked up. His eyes were startlingly clear, a pale blue in his weathered face. They weren't mean eyes. They were just, tired. He looked at her, a tiny girl with big, serious eyes, holding out a glass and a piece of fruit. He looked from her to the crumbling house she had come from. A flicker of something, surprise, confusion, passed over his face. You need this more than I do, kid, he rumbled, his voice like gravel rolling downhill. "No," Imani said, her voice shaking but firm. "You're stuck. And you're wet." She pushed the offering a little closer. "It's just water." "And an apple." He stared at her for a long moment, the rain dripping from his beard. Then, he slowly wiped his greasy hands on his jeans and reached out. His hand was huge, covered in faded tattoos and scars, and it completely engulfed the small glass. He drank the water in 3 long swallows, his Adam's apple bobbing. He handed the empty glass back to her. Then he took the apple. "Thank you," he said. The words sounded unused, like they'd been sitting in a dusty box for a long time. It was then that she saw them. Across the street, peeking from the alleyway, were 2 of Silas's men. They were watching. Their presence was a cold spike of fear in her gut. They were always watching. The biker followed her gaze. He saw the men, saw the way they smirked before melting back into the shadows. He looked back at Imani, and for the first time, he saw the fear in her eyes. It was a deep, old fear. He understood. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of people cornered by predators. Panic and desperation surged through Imani. This man was leaving. He was a ship passing in the night. But he was strong. He wasn't afraid of men like Silas. This was her only chance, a wild, impossible shot in the dark. Her hand darted into the pocket of her worn dress, where she kept a small, stubby pencil and a folded piece of paper from her school notebook. It was a habit, for drawing or writing down thoughts. She had been doodling on it earlier, but now it had a new purpose. While his back was turned for a second as he looked at his bike, her fingers flew. She didn't have time for sentences. She wrote 2 words. Help US. It was a child's scrawl, messy and desperate. A signal flare fired from a sinking ship. As he turned back to her, she quickly and discreetly pressed the folded paper into his large hand as she took the empty glass. Her fingers brushed against his rough skin. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible touch. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading, conveying everything she couldn't say. "Please. We're alone. We're scared." He glanced down at the paper in his palm, his expression unreadable. He didn't open it. He just closed his fist around it, the small note disappearing into his grasp. He gave her a long, hard look, and then a slow, single nod. It could have meant anything. It could have meant nothing. A moment later, with a final twist of his wrench, the engine roared back to life, a sudden, violent explosion of sound that made Imani jump. The thunder had returned. He swung his leg back over the seat, the leather creaking. He looked at her one last time. "Stay safe, kid," he growled over the engine's roar. And then he was gone, a black shape disappearing into the gray curtain of rain, leaving behind only the smell of gasoline and the echo of a promise that might have been a figment of her imagination. 2 weeks passed. The rain stopped, but the grayness remained, seeped into the very bones of their house and their hearts. The biker did not return. The note, Imani was sure, had been forgotten, tossed away at the first trash can, a meaningless piece of litter from a meaningless girl. Hope, which had flared for a brief, brilliant moment, had been extinguished, leaving behind the bitter smoke of disappointment. Silas's campaign of terror escalated. A dead rat was left on their doorstep. The word "leave" was spray-painted in angry red letters across their fence. Then came the final notice, a real one this time, taped to their door. It was an official eviction order, signed by a judge. Silas had found a legal loophole, a way to use the system against them. They had 30 days. Ilara seemed to shrink. The fight went out of her eyes, replaced by a profound, bottomless despair. She spent most of her days in her armchair, a blanket pulled up to her chin, staring at a wall as if she could see all their memories playing out on its cracked plaster. Imani felt a frantic, desperate energy. She tried to be brave for her grandmother. She scrubbed the graffiti off the fence until her fingers were raw. She threw the rat in the dumpster, trying not to cry. She read the eviction notice over and over, as if the words might change. They never did. She thought about the biker every day. She replayed their brief encounter in her mind, searching for a sign she might have missed. The way he looked at her. The single, slow nod. Had it been a promise? Or was it just a polite dismissal, a gesture to placate a frightened child? She had bet her last sliver of hope on a stranger, and she had lost. The final day arrived. It was the end of the month. Silas had told them he would be there at noon, with men, to help them move their things. They both knew what that meant. Their meager possessions would be thrown onto the street. The locks would be changed. Their world would be erased. Imani packed a small bag for them, Elara's medicine, a change of clothes for each of them, the old photo album, and the last of their food, a box of crackers and a jar of peanut butter. They had nowhere to go. A shelter, maybe. But the thought of it, of being lost in a sea of strangers, was terrifying. At 11:30, they sat in the living room, waiting. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old mantel clock, each tick a hammer blow marking the final seconds of their life here. Imani held her grandmother's trembling hand. "We'll be all right, Grandma," she whispered, the lie catching in her throat. Elara squeezed her hand weakly. "You are a good girl, Imani." The best girl. A tear slipped down Imani's cheek. She had failed. She had failed to protect her home, her grandmother, her world. Then, she heard it. It was faint at first, a low hum on the edge of hearing. She thought it might be a distant plane. But it didn't fade. It grew. A low, steady rumble that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The windows began to vibrate, a soft, insistent rattling. The water in the glass on the table shivered. Elara looked up, her eyes wide with confusion. "What is that noise?" The rumble grew into a roar. It was a deep, chest-thumping thunder that drowned out the ticking of the clock, drowned out every other sound in the world. It was the sound of an approaching army. Imani ran to the window. Her heart stopped. The street, their quiet, forgotten street, was no longer empty. It was filled, from curb to curb, with motorcycles. It was a river of black leather and polished chrome, a tidal wave of steel and horsepower. There were dozens of them, then 50, then 100. They kept coming, pouring in from the main road, an endless procession of roaring engines. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, filling every inch of available space until the entire block was a parking lot for a biker army. Men started to dismount. They were all shapes and sizes, but they all wore the same uniform of leather and denim, and on every back was the same patch. The grinning skull. The Hell's Angels. The neighborhood froze. Doors slammed shut. Curtains twitched. Faces, pale with shock and fear, peered out at the invading force. Across the street, Silas and his two thugs had just pulled up. They got out of their car, their smug expressions dissolving into pure, unadulterated terror. They stood frozen, like statues, staring at the impossible sight before them. The engines cut out, one by one, until a sudden, profound silence fell over the street. The only sound was the nervous chirping of a bird and the thumping of Imani's own heart. From the center of the formation, a path cleared. A single figure walked forward. It was him. The biker from that rainy day. He moved with an unhurried, commanding stride, his boots silent on the asphalt. He stopped at the edge of Imani's lawn and looked directly at her, standing small and stunned in the window. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled something out. It was a small, crumpled piece of notebook paper. He held it up for her to see. Then, his voice, a low rumble that carried across the silent street, cut through the tension. "A signal was received," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "We're here to answer." Imani felt the tears she had been holding back for weeks finally break free. They streamed down her face, hot and cleansing. It wasn't a dream. He had come back. He had heard her. The giant biker, whose name she would later learn was Bear, walked up the porch steps. He didn't knock. He just stood there, waiting. Imani fumbled with the lock and opened the door. He looked down at her, his expression softening just a fraction. "Is this the man causing you trouble?" he asked, nodding his head toward the petrified Silas. Imani could only nod, unable to speak. Bear turned. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. "Silas," he called out. His voice was calm, but it held the weight of the 100 men standing behind him. Silas flinched as if he'd been struck. He took an involuntary step back. "I understand this property belongs to the lady of this house," Bear continued, his tone conversational. "And I understand you've been mistaken about that fact. You have a choice. You can leave this neighborhood, and this city, and never come back. Or you can stay and discuss the matter further with my associates. They are very interested in property law." A few of the bikers near the front grinned, cracking their knuckles. The threat was unspoken but perfectly, terrifyingly clear. Silas didn't need to be told twice. He and his men scrambled back into their car, fumbling with the keys, and sped away with a squeal of tires. They were gone. Just like that. The monster that had haunted her life was gone. But the bikers didn't leave. Bear turned back to Imani. "My name is Bear. Your grandmother is Alara?" Imani nodded again. "One of my men is a paramedic. He's going to check on her, if that's all right." Before Imani could answer, a man with a medical bag was already walking up the steps, his smile gentle and reassuring. Other men started to unload tools and equipment from their bikes and a support truck that had pulled up at the end of the street. The note just said, "Help," Bear explained, looking at the broken fence and the cardboard-patched window. "So we brought a little bit of everything. We've got carpenters, plumbers, electricians. Figured we'd start with the roof." What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. The quiet, forgotten street transformed into a bustling construction site. Men swarmed over the house like a colony of determined ants. Ladders went up. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air. Shingles were torn off the roof and replaced. The broken window was removed and a new pane of glass was expertly fitted into the frame. Another group of bikers tackled the yard. The weeds were pulled, the lawn was mowed, and the graffiti on the fence was sanded down and given a fresh coat of white paint. Someone even replanted the small flower bed Alara had long ago given up on. A biker with a long, braided beard, who looked like a Viking, turned out to be an electrician. He spent hours in the house, rewiring, replacing faulty outlets, and installing new, bright light fixtures. The house, which had been dark and gloomy for years, was suddenly filled with warm, steady light. Someone else brought in bags and boxes of groceries, filling the empty pantry and refrigerator until they were overflowing. Fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, milk, more food than Imani had seen in her entire life. Through it all, Imani and Alara sat on the porch, wrapped in warm blankets someone had given them, watching in stunned, silent awe. Alara's eyes, which had been so dull with despair, were now wide with disbelief and wonder. The paramedic had checked her vitals, given her a new inhaler, and spoken to her with a kindness that brought tears to her eyes. The work continued all day, a symphony of coordinated, efficient labor. These men, feared and misunderstood, were rebuilding Imani's world from the ground up. They worked with a quiet, focused respect. There was no loud talk, no crude jokes. Just the steady, rhythmic sounds of renewal. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the work was finished. The house no longer leaned. It stood straight and proud. It had a new roof, new windows, a fixed porch, and a painted fence. Inside, the lights glowed warmly, the plumbing worked without a drip, and the air was clean and dry. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home. It was a fortress. Bear approached the porch, the other bikers gathering silently behind him. He held out a thick envelope. "What is this?" Imani asked, her voice small. "We had a talk with the bank," Bear said simply. "A very productive talk. The mortgage is paid in full. This house belongs to you and your grandmother. No one can ever take it from you again." He then pointed to a small, discreet security camera that had been installed above the door. "And that connects directly to us. Think of it as a new doorbell. If you ever have any trouble, from anyone, you push the button we installed inside. We'll be here." The promise hung in the air. It wasn't just a promise of help. It was a promise of protection. Of family. Imani finally found her voice. "Why?" she whispered, looking up at the giant of a man. "Why would you do all this, for a glass of water and an apple?" Bear knelt, bringing himself down to her eye level. His pale blue eyes were serious. "Because you didn't see a monster, kid. You saw a man in the rain. You gave what you had, even when you had nothing. That kind of honor, that's our currency. You don't put a price on it. You just pay it back." Paid in full, he stood up and turned to his men. It was time to go. The bikers began to mount their machines, the quiet efficiency of their arrival mirrored in their departure. The street was once again filled with the thunder of engines, but this time, it wasn't a frightening sound. It was the sound of safety. The sound of hope. Bear got on his bike and looked back at Imani one last time. He raised a single, gloved hand in a slow salute. Imani raised her own small hand in return. Then, as one, the river of steel and chrome began to move. They flowed out of the street, a dark, powerful current, their taillights receding like red stars until they were gone. And then, there was silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the lonely, fearful silence of before. It was a peaceful, secure silence. Imani stood on her new, sturdy porch, breathing in the cool night air. Her house was warm. Her grandmother was safe. Her world, which had once been so small and fragile, now felt boundless. A 10-year-old girl had sent out a signal, a desperate plea in 2 words, and an army of angels on iron horses had answered the call.